These ancient stone foundations in Jerusalem represent the epicenter of a massive religious and political shift. Following the Roman execution of a carpenter named Jesus, a radical new sect began to emerge, claiming their leader had returned to life. To the religious establishment, this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a destabilizing force that threatened the fragile peace they maintained with their Roman occupiers. Any movement that appeared to challenge the social order could result in Rome dismantling the city's remaining autonomy. This is an open Hebrew Torah scroll. For the ruling religious council, the laws contained in these pages were the only thing preserving their identity. They viewed the new Christian sect as a direct violation of these ancient boundaries. This conflict left no room for compromise. The religious leadership decided that the only way to safeguard their traditions was to authorize a systematic crackdown to identify and remove the new believers. The most effective agent in this crackdown was a man named Saul of Tarsus. Saul held a unique position of power. He was a brilliant Pharisee trained in the intricacies of the law, but he was also a Roman citizen, a status that gave him legal protections and mobility most Jews did not possess. Saul was driven by a conviction that he was doing God's work. To him, every new convert was a threat to the law of Moses, and he believed the total removal of the sect was a religious necessity. This campaign turned violent in the public square. Saul stood by and gave his official approval during the stoning of Stephen, the movement's first martyr, watching as the crowd crushed the man to death. Following that execution, Saul secured official warrants from the high priest in Jerusalem. These documents gave him the authority to cross borders, hunting down believers who had fled the city and pursuing them as far as Damascus. Saul's ability to utilize both religious law and Roman warrants put the early church in a state of constant flight. With their leaders in prison and their members scattered, the movement's presence in Jerusalem began to dissolve. Saul traveled this long desert road toward Damascus, moving with the momentum of a man who believed his mission was sanctioned by God himself. But he never reached his destination. A light from heaven suddenly struck Saul, throwing him to the ground and instantly blinding him. In the dirt, Saul heard a voice speak directly to him, asking a single question. "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" When the voice identified itself as Jesus, Saul's worldview was destroyed. He had spent his life convinced he was defending God's honor, only to realize he was actually declaring war on the Messiah. In a single moment, the man with the authority to imprison a whole city was reduced to a blind traveler, stripped of his sight and his mission. Saul was led into Damascus to this location, the street called Straight. He spent 3 days in darkness, refusing food and water, while he grappled with the total collapse of his previous life. A local believer named Ananias was told to go to Saul. It was an incredibly dangerous request. Saul was famous for coming to Damascus specifically to chain people like Ananias. Ananias chose to trust the instruction. He found Saul, laid hands on him, and as Saul's sight returned, he was baptized and took on a new name, Paul. Paul immediately began preaching in the local synagogues, claiming that Jesus was the Son of God. His former allies viewed this as a betrayal of the highest order and immediately organized a plot to kill him. The city gates were guarded, so Paul's new companions had to smuggle him out. They placed him in a basket and lowered him down the exterior of the stone city wall under the cover of night. Paul escaped Damascus by abandoning the very authority he had arrived with, joining the community he had originally been sent to dismantle. Paul returned to Jerusalem to meet the apostles, but the transition was difficult. Men like Peter and John had to decide if they could trust a man who had helped murder their friends. Paul's new role was distinct from the others. He believed he was called to take the message of Jesus beyond the Jewish world to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish nations of the Roman Empire. This required a massive theological shift. Paul taught that faith was the primary requirement for following Jesus, removing the need to adopt the exclusive rules of the Mosaic Law. By stripping away these cultural barriers, Paul allowed the faith to take root in different societies. This expansion took Paul into the heart of the Greek world. He traveled to cities like Corinth, standing near temples like this one dedicated to Apollo, to present his message to philosophers and merchants. By dismantling the requirement of the law for new converts, Paul shifted Christianity from a regional sect into a message that could spread to any culture. Paul's later years were marked by a striking irony. He began to endure the exact same violence and imprisonment that he had once used as a tool against the church. He was beaten, targeted by mobs, and faced multiple assassination plots. He spent years in prisons across the Mediterranean, writing letters that would later define much of the New Testament. When he was arrested again in Jerusalem, Paul used his Roman citizenship as a strategic shield. He bypassed the local religious courts and appealed his case directly to the emperor in Rome. Because of that appeal, the Roman government was forced to escort him to the capital. He traveled along the Appian Way, using the empire's own roads to reach the seat of power. Paul ended his journey here, in the Roman Forum, the seat of the government that had authorized the execution of Jesus 30 years earlier. The man who once carried warrants to destroy the church ended his life as its most prolific architect. His transition from an enforcer to a missionary facilitated the spread of the movement